الحمد لله نستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ونشهد أن سيدنا مولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله تعالى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to our Balagh Academy webinar on the fiqh of halal and haram. Now, the fiqh of halal and haram is quite a huge discussion, but what we're going to do is focus on a couple of topics, and just for the benefit of the timings that we have available to us, inshallah, what we will do is focus on mainly questions related to personal life as well as public life. And in particular, the sort of common questions that we get asked is mainly in terms of Islamic finance, issues related to marriage and divorce, for example, and a number of different sort of questions around the contemporary type of stuff that we are faced with in terms of our technologies, and also medical fiqh and various other things that you feel would be the most appropriate thing to ask our panelists today. Now, let me just give you a very brief outline of our panelists. I won't go into too much detail. So we have with us Mufti Zubair. Most of you are familiar with him. So he's the chair of Al-Qalam. We have Mufti Amjad Mohammed, who is also somebody who leads on the Iftar department of Wifaq al-Ulama. And at the same time, we have Mufti Abdullah Nana, who is also somebody who leads on the American Fiqh Academy, USA. So clearly we have some leaders amongst the experts in fiqh here today with us, who clearly deal not only with their regular masail that they are approached with on day-to-day fiqh, but also they work very closely with other Muslim scholars who deal with the same sort of areas. So they are quite well endowed in the subjects that hopefully, inshallah, we will be discussing. Now, let me just start by initiating how we should work today. So the idea is that we have the Q&A. So please use the Q&A. Don't use chat, because that can be used for other things, mainly sort of technical messages that are sent here and there. And this is all your platform. So inshallah, the whole purpose of this webinar was for you to ask the questions. This is all about you. So this is your opportunity to ask as many questions as you want around things that be really relevant to today in contemporary time. Now, just to give you some kind of expertise, you all know the expertise of some of our members. They've got quite broad expertise on a number of different areas. Most of them are generalists, as well as having their own particular specialist areas. So what I will do is I will allow you to, number one, either type in your questions on Q&A, or if any of you want to ask particular questions and come online, then inshallah that's okay too. Okay. So before I start addressing some of the questions, what I'll do is I'll put some questions forward, and these are questions from those viewers who have been here on previous sessions, as well as just recently. So I think it might be worthwhile just asking a couple of these questions now. So let's bring this first to Mufti Zubair. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Mufti Sahib, you okay?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Okay, so Mufti, there's a question for you, maybe probably appropriate for you. And this question is related to, and what I'll do is I'll actually state the question, because these are questions that individuals have actually asked. Yeah. And the first question is about conventional products such as offset mortgages. So offset mortgages, for the viewers, are those kind of mortgages which are attached to savings accounts. So people can actually pay off their mortgage in large sums even before they start incurring interest. So those kind of mortgages, these potentially become more halal than the Islamic finance. And so these are this person's own words, yeah? In terms of, they become more halal than the Islamic finance products, especially when there could be 0% interest or a negligible amount if averaged over a number of years. So the home buyer actually gets a better deal on purchasing the asset as well, What's the Islamic stance to that? What's your opinion regarding this? Again, having an offset mortgage.
I think you probably need to clarify what you mean exactly by offset mortgage. What are we talking about here?
So I'm assuming, I'm just going back to the question, but I'm assuming what he's basically saying is where the interest is minimized or basically nullified on the basis that the amount is paid well beforehand. What's your understanding about offset mortgage?
On offset mortgage, where somebody will have an account in the bank and a savings, for example, a savings account in a bank, and that will generate interest.
Right.
And then with the same bank, they take out a loan, and that also, that also there's interest payable on that loan. So the offset mortgage would, the interest in the mortgage would be offset against the interest earned in the in the account. Okay, so potentially you're paying zero interest.
Okay, right.
Okay.
That's
So now,
fine.
yeah. So if it is a case where you are paying no interest because of the combination of having an account with the bank and also taking out an interest-bearing mortgage, but the two cancel each other out, then provided it stays combined and provided there is no interest whatsoever, then okay, fine. You could say that is a permissible form of home purchasing, right? However, to say that is better than a Islamic finance product, that is questionable, because an Islamic finance product is not a loan. It doesn't incur any interest whatsoever, and the fact that it might be more expensive it does not affect the halal status of the home purchasing product. So whereas in this particular offset mortgage, you at least agree to earn interest and pay interest, even though one cancel out the other.
Right. Okay. Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense then. So clearly, you are getting involved in interest, even with that.
You agree to pay interest, you agree to earn interest, but the situation that he has described in the question is that they both cancel each other out. If there's even a minimal paid or a minimal earned, then that's impermissible.
Right. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to some of the other questions.
One thing I would say though here
is
the halalness of a home purchase plan shouldn't be measured on how expensive or cheap it is. That's what the mistake we make, is that we think it's halal only if it's cheaper or equivalent. That's not a criteria for measuring halal.
Okay, sure. Right. Just analysis of some of the way that some of these questions are being asked by our viewers. Can I ask that you make your questions very short, not long? If your question's too long, I won't be able to read it out because we don't have the time for long questions. Make it very short, 2 to 3 lines maximum, and then inshallah we can put that to our panelists. Now, let's just move on very quickly to Mufti Amjad. Maybe something that you could address here, which is a quite important question. People do ask this kind of question. Now, I'm going to frame some of these questions in a way that will probably be conducive to today's webinar as well. So let's talk about halal and haram food in particular. Now, how stringent should we be as Muslims? You know, when you go through the e-codes and various other codes and, to that level of detail, when we go to our supermarkets, how stringent should we be about looking into these codes to identify whether this product is halal and haram? Yeah, to what degree should we go about doing this?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Obviously, intaking of the permissible and avoiding the haram is essential. What we eat literally makes us. And obviously, there are ahkam associated with that. It's unfortunate now, most of us need a food technology degree to try to understand the back of tins and boxes and the rest of it, because it's not as straightforward as just the ingredients, but that's a good starting point. So if you know that something is impermissible in that it's something which clearly has been made illegal, then obviously one should avoid from that. I guess the telltale signs are the vegetarian signs and the vegan signs. That's a good telltale sign. But also there can be sometimes the use of alcohol. So one has to be a little bit careful about that. Having said that, we notice that in the way that food is processed nowadays, there tends to be a lot of use of alcohol because of the fact that it's a good organic solvent. It will allow organic compounds to dissolve in it, whereas aqueous products won't work like that. So as a result, you may see the use of alcohol in products, but that's really because it's there as a solvent. And the fuqaha have said that because it's not obviously khamr, and the quantity is significantly insignificant, if there is such a phrase, as a result, there is permissibility to take those products. Also, sometimes people get a little bit confused with the word alcohol. Alcohol is obviously a body of organic compounds, organic molecules. You can have benzyl alcohol, you can have so many different types of alcohol. It's really the OH group, which is the alcohol part. And as a result, just because you see the word alcohol written on the back of something doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethyl alcohol, ethanol. So one has to sort of, kind of do some form of, by just looking at the back and making a decision from that. There are times, obviously, when there's in situ impurities which come about. However, we find that in most cases we are, so whether it's something like nabidh, for example, nabidh, we know that there will be some small percentage of alcohol that's been formed as the sugars of the fruit juices are converting. There will obviously be that. However, obviously, and in bread, you'll be surprised that there's a percentage of alcohol as well due to again, the carbohydrate breakdown as the CO2 is escaping and the bubbles you get inside your bread. But in those certain cases, again, we're not held to account. One general point I'd like to make is that sometimes we use the chemical analyses that we have at hand now, where we can go down to the parts per million, parts per billion in multi-million-pound laboratories, and we use that as the science to determine the legality of something or the illegality of something. We need to kind of put our minds back 1,000 years ago, when really it was observational empirical science. Yani it was sight, smell, and taste. That was the science. So if you wanted to find out if something was organic or aqueous, you literally put it on the tip of your tongue. And if you read some of the scientists who existed about 500, 1,000 years ago, that's literally the way they used to carry out analysis when there was no other way of doing it. So we need to kind of, be wary of that we don't start using the science of modern technology and then kind of drop it, or whatever the phrase is, to cast it backwards and then use that criteria. I think hopefully that question's been addressed.
That's a very quite extensive response. And since you're on the topic of alcohol, what would be the response to hand sanitizers that clearly contain alcohol? There's two questions. It's a two-pronged question. One is, what's the minimum the maximum percentage of alcohol that we can expect in products for us to say that, okay, this would be acceptable? I think that's quite a confusing question, but anyway. And the second one is regarding hand sanitizers, which so basically it's about sort of using sort of disinfectants and things like that contain alcohol. What's the
one is the concern of its najis nature, and one is the concern of its intoxicating nature. So when we look at alcohol, we've got to look at it as your two-pronged question has got a sort of two-pronged answer. First of all, is something najis, and secondly, is it an intoxicant? So when we look at hand sanitizers, and obviously it's not considered as a najis in that the method, the synthetic process which has gone through to manufacture it, it would not necessitate it be considered as impurity that we're putting on our hands. Whereas, getting wine from grapes or something is an impurity as well. So it's like, similar to, say, urine or feces. So therefore, that hukum doesn't apply to it. And because we're not consuming it, then in those cases, again, it is permitted. So there is permissibility for utilizing in that way. When I talk about significant quantities of alcohol, we're talking really extremely small concentrations when it's used as a solvent for flavors and additives and things of that nature. And not only that, the process that it goes through, yes, it is the additional intention, sorry, it's the intentional addition of an impurity, of an intoxicant rather. However, the process that it will go through also ensures that there's very little or any of what remains in the final product. It's only because of processing foods that this has become an issue. If we go back to the old days, so to speak, when we didn't need to keep food in a tin for X number of months, and we didn't need to have food that stayed for so long. In fact, we literally ate what we brought into the home within a day or 2 days, apart from, say, meat that we would dry and remove as much moisture as possible so there'd be less opportunity for bacteria. then, it's the modern world we live in. If we want to go back to the old days and kind of the village life, then I guess we can avoid a lot of these things. But we, the fuqaha have to be practical. We're trying to live in this world that we're in. And this again really manifests the robustness of the Sharia, alhamdulillah, in that even this modern world that we live in, whether we're speaking of mortgages or whether we're speaking of food technology, it still has a response to it, and can still navigate us to live as Muslims in this world.
Okay, so so differentiating between alcohol being used in the process of manufacture and alcohol used as in essence as ingredients, particularly for that particular purpose, and differentiating between the two. Okay, right. We got a question on for Mufti Abdullah Nana. Mufti Abdullah Nana, every time we sort of get you on the webinars, you're always sat in a car with your seatbelt on, mashallah. Are you traveling?
No, early morning. It's also dark here as well. So early morning. It's six in the morning here right now.
Yeah, 6 o'clock in the morning. Subhanallah. Okay, right. So we got a question for you. 6 o'clock in the morning. Zakat that needs to be paid. In fact, probably a better approach to this is let me ask this other question, because I think this is probably more relevant for UK. The question is regarding interest incurred in our accounts, our savings accounts. Now, how do we deal with those interests? What can we do with that interest money? Can we just give it away to a charity? Is that sufficient? Or do we need to ensure that we're looking for accounts where clearly there is no interest?
So the first question is with regards to accepting interest in our bank accounts. So at least in America, yeah, we do have two choices in most banks. We have the savings account and we have the current account. For example, the bank account which I have, I avoid interest because it's a current checking account, and I don't have to take interest. However, it does depend on the bank whether they offer those options or not. But I would say first of all, if the person does have a choice, ideally they would choose the checking accounts or the accounts without interest, so that they're not involved in that interest-bearing transaction. Yes, if they don't have a choice and the bank account which they do choose to open is providing them with interest, then the safest thing to do with regards to that interest would be give it to the poor. Wajib at-tasadduq ala al-fuqara, give it to the same people who are deserving of zakat. Now, there are two opinions with regards to giving zakat to other causes. Mufti Abdul Rahim Lajpuri has written about this, and I believe there's some fatwas published in the UK as well. So there is one opinion that zakat, that interest money can be used to build, for example, bathrooms in a masjid and so on. But because that opinion is not universally accepted, I would say the safest thing is just to give it to the poor. Give it those same people who are deserving of zakat, give it to them. That way, you know that you're absolved of your obligation and that you've done the right thing. And if someone wants to look into that second opinion, inshallah, they can consult with the muftis and discuss that with them. If, for example, they want to use that interest money for other causes and other purposes, there is one opinion, and they can refer to the local mufti to discuss that second opinion.
Okay, I have another question for you regarding inheritance. I think this is probably something that's quite common in America, probably more so in the UK, and that is where you have converts to Islam. So the issue in terms of inheritance for them is such that, for example, if they become Muslim and they have passed away, and then clearly they've got, so it's more a sense of advice rather than a fiqh mas'ala. Now, so clearly they've got inheritance that is going to go to their children. And let's say some of their children are non-Muslim. Now, they're going to see that quite unethical. There's going to be some serious issues with that. What kind of advice would you give to those, number one, those who are inheriting as well as those who are giving inheritance in this respect? Is there any particular advice that you can handle? It's quite a broad question.
It is. So the main challenge is, as the scholars have stated, Islam and kufr, right? If a person is a Muslim and they have relatives who are disbelievers, then as a result, there is no inheritance between these two groups, right? That is the normal rule. So a Muslim relative should not be inheriting from a non-Muslim relative, and a non-Muslim relative, on the flip side, a non-Muslim relative should not be inheriting from a Muslim relative. At the same time, there is the books of Fatawa do discuss the scope of wasiyah. So wasiyah is something related to inheritance, but slightly different. The best way to explain it would be a bequest, or would be a gift during a person's lifetime, right? So there are different forms of wasiyah, but wasiyah is slightly different than inheritance. So especially in the case where a person does have non-Muslim relatives who do want to support this Muslim, and who do want to leave some money back behind for the Muslim relative, there are procedures for which the Muslim can ensure that he does receive some money, and ideally this should all be discussed beforehand. It wouldn't make sense to wait till the person's passed away and then deciding what to do. But during the person's lifetime, there are arrangements that can be made. And wasiyah would mean that the non-Muslim relative, for example, the non-Muslim relative would specify this money which I'm assigning or appointing to my Muslim relative, it's not inheritance, rather it will be a bequest, and certain rules with regards to a bequest would apply, right? So also related to your question as well, while we're at it, we highly recommend, especially living in Western countries, no one knows when death will happen, and especially now with the coronavirus situation, we're seeing so much death around us, and so many young people also passing away. So as the Prophet Muhammad has encouraged us, a person should ensure that they always have their will and their Islamic will written out. Otherwise, if it's not written out and something does happen, there will be great complications. I don't know about the UK situation, but here in America, if a Muslim passes away without leaving a proper Islamic will, there are numerous complications. You end up having to go to court, and sometimes there's chances where that money will not, part of that money will not reach the Muslim relatives, right? So it's extremely important to have a proper will written out, an Islamic will written out, and also to go. It also requires us to consult with estate lawyers as well, right? Because one is the Mufti telling you, these are the shares. Your relative XYZ will receive 12%. Your other relative will receive 1/3. That's not enough. In the countries we live in order to ensure that that will is recognized and enforceable by the law of the land, you have to ensure that you have a legal will written out as well, right? So I think that's related to any question related to inheritance. I should cover that as well. That ensure that everything is written out, and clear instructions are there just in case something happens. May Allah forbid.
That's a very, very, very important message there. So for those of you listening, the importance of actually writing a will, especially if you're a minority in a non-Muslim country, in terms of how the share of your inheritance is given out to your relatives. Okay, so we've got a really good question here by an individual who wants to. Well, I'm just going to read out. So this is for you, Mufti Zubair. It's your area. So the question is it permissible to join occupational work pension, in particular civil service or other government pension schemes, which are based around careers? Yeah. So this individual is saying there's been contradictory information regarding this amongst ulama. Some say it's haram, some say it's halal, on the basis of this. What's your take on that?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. First of all, I would say for full details, if you go onto the Al-Qalam website, you'll find I've written a detailed fatwa on this. But just to explain very briefly, in the UK, we have two basic type of pensions. One is known as money purchase, and one is known as defined benefit. Defined benefit simply means that when a person reaches pension age, according to a certain calculation, they will receive a pension. Okay, and for example, if they have 40 to 60 years of service, that will be multiplied by a certain calculation. Previously, they used to do the final salary, is that this is the final salary that you are receiving at the end, and maybe 60% of that is what you will receive. Now they are moving more, because that's a bit quite expensive, they're moving more towards an average salary pension scheme where the average salary is calculated and maybe you get 60% of that. So it's a rough calculation like that. And you continue to get it until you are alive, until your nominated beneficiary is alive, after that which it ceases. Now, this type of pension is simply a promise to give you, or an agreement to give you, continue to give you a wage effectively until you are alive and until your spouse, for example, are alive. Okay. Now the issue with this particular this particular pension, you don't own anything in the pension pot. It's simply the employer will continue to pay you a wage effectively from whatever the employer wants. Okay, that's not your concern. And now the problem with this kind of pension is that how long are you going to live, and how long is your spouse going to live, etc. Will you even reach pension age? This is uncertainty. So the qiyas would be the logical conclusion would be that this has a defective clause in there. It's defective because of the uncertainty in terms of whether you're actually going to get paid, for how long you're going to get paid, and so therefore because of the jahala, in according to strict analogy, it is impermissible. However, because this is a practice that is prevalent, and jahala is only prohibited because it results in a dispute. However, these types of pension don't end up in dispute because you know exactly what you're going to get according to terms and conditions. So therefore, that becomes permissible, and so a work-based pension like that, which is a defined benefit scheme, average salary or final salary, that is okay in principle. However, there are sometimes you can have additional options in there which might make it impermissible. For example, if you give additional money in, etc., you might get additional pension. Those areas can be tricky, but the basic pension itself, that would be permissible. The other type of pension is a money purchase. Is basically where a deduction is made from your wage, and the employer also puts in a certain amount, and that goes in a pot that is invested on your behalf. So effectively, from your wage, you are making an investment. Now, the permissibility of that depends on the terms and conditions of the pension fund, and also how it is being invested. Is it invested in halal? Is it invested in haram? Is it normally you find that the pensions need to be invested in something that will give more or less a certain return. So they tend to be interested in interest-bearing sort of structures, or structures that are, of that nature. And so a lot of what is, whereas we get investment in shares, they tend to be more volatile and less certain for the pension fund, and so therefore they're featureless. So generally these tend to be impermissible. However, you can get halal pension funds that have been certified as being halal, which act more upon a mudaraba type of, or a ijara or a wakala type of structure, wherein there is an asset that is probably is a riskier investment, but or relatively more riskier investment than a normal investment, but it is in principle halal. So somebody who has that kind of pension will need to ensure that the pension fund that there is being invested in is actually halal.
So does that address the issue regarding ISAs, that we have at the moment?
ISAs are just forms of savings accounts.
Yeah, like investments.
Yeah, in fact, again, the same thing would apply there.
I'm going to ask you that question in addition to this because that's been asked a few times. Go on.
Yeah. So, an ISA is in the individual saving account. It can be asset-based, or it can be just effectively a loan to the person who you have the ISA with, and if it becomes a loan, then any return on that, it would be impermissible. That's simply interest.
Yeah.
If it's invested on your behalf, then yes, it can potentially. Sometimes what can happen is you can, as an ISA, you can sort of put money aside to a certain amount, and then a third party, sometimes that being the government, will give you an additional increment. That can be permissible if a third party is doing it. However, if you are lending to the government and then the government gives you an increment, that is not permissible. It depends. So it depends on the type of ISA.
Okay, alhamdulillah, that's a very comprehensive response. So hopefully that's addressed a number of questions that I've had also. I'm going to go to Mufti Amjad, and this is a question, the typical question everybody asks around sort of their dinner table, is the issue about cryptocurrencies. So there's a bit of confusion about this. I'm afraid I'm going to throw this one at you. So give us a bit of an outline, rather than say halal, haram, but just give a bit of an outline. What is the current landscape on this? From an Islamic perspective, what's going on around on this discussion about cryptocurrencies? Because it's becoming a real big hot topic now. Everybody's talking about. I'm getting it in my own home. Subhanallah.
Okay. I don't know if I think I should start with Bismillah, and then after that, A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem. Trying to answer this question. Okay. Well, the thing is, cryptocurrency obviously is a new phenomenon. People are still trying to work their way around what it involves, what it doesn't involve. What the blockchain is, how does it operate? The fact that there's no centralized banking, is that a problem? Is that a good thing? Is it a good thing that it's out of the hands of the bankers and that the community can have its own? Some people have argued it's more like gold and silver then, and surely that is more Shari'a oriented rather than being in the control of the bankers who can stick inflation on it and throw the currency value up and down. So the arguments are there. However, the position that I adopted, I think few years back or a couple of years back, I can't recall when, and I've not really seen anything, and not that I've read into it in any more detail after that, but there's nothing that's really been sort of come under my nose which has changed my view on it. There's too much uncertainty in cryptocurrency. In fact, probably Bitcoin is a good example of that. I know some people will say, well, that surely uncertainty doesn't determine the halalness of something or the haramness of something. It's just the way things are allocated. For example, how the blockchain is put together, how that is then given to a particular person who mines it. Obviously, there's only a certain amount of cryptocurrency that will exist. Once you've mined it all, there's also payments then given out. So, as I said, it's not something that it's dubious at best. Then, if I was to trying to keep all the brothers on one page, then let's go for dubious and shak and doubtful. It's also a good cloak for fraud. For example, OneCoin came out supposedly a few years back. And people were selling it, even though it didn't exist, but they were selling it and also its investment system to unfortunately gullible people, because it said this is the next Bitcoin, you're going to become a multimillionaire. And so many people bought into that, and average normal people, and unfortunately made a lot of people bankrupt because it doesn't exist. OneCoin does not exist. It's a facade. It's a fake, and that's the issue. That as much as we don't want the bankers benefiting from us and, inflation and all the rest of it. The issue there always has to be, when it comes to a legitimate currency, there always has to be some administrative body that overlooks it and ensures its operational kind of structures and infrastructure. That doesn't exist with cryptocurrency. They keep saying that, eventually it will replace currency. It's the next thing, whatever. They've been saying that for 5-10 years now, whatever, since it came onto the scene. It hasn't happened. I can't see it happening. I think there was somebody who recently, quite senior, involved in the currency, world currency, came out and said that it's not something we take seriously, even Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has been established. So it's not something, as I said, we should get involved in. If obviously somebody's purchased it as an investment, because there's two aspects to it. One is the fact that as use as a currency. The other one is obviously people buy it as a form of investment. If you buy, 0.5 Bitcoin and it's worth 25 grand or something, and then you hope it'll go up and then you can sort of sell it on, then it will be like any other form of investment in terms of Zakat purposes and all the rest of it. But as a currency, it's not something. I know there's other ulama that are working on it and they can see the merits in it and they're progressing it. But I would say that's really an ijtihadi project. It's not a fatwa. It's not a position. It's really fuqaha that are engaging with it, seeing if there's any merit in it, trying to develop the fiqh around it whilst it's ongoing. So we can merit that, and you can say that's good. But in terms of as a position, then that's how I understand it.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Musa. Okay, Mufti Abdullah Nana, I've got I think quite a difficult question for you actually. And this is related to al-i'anatu ala al-ithm. Yeah. So in terms of, what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame it from a question that this particular individual has asked, because it's a quite common question. A lot of ulama get asked this question. And there is somebody who's working in a bank, and they work on IT services, mainly in a bank. So part of their work is dealing with data related to loans. Okay. So this individual wants to ask, is that halal earning?
So this is a very common question, specifically with the banking industry, and unfortunately, a good percentage of Muslims already are working at banks. So the best research which I've seen is that we have to look at things from two different perspectives. One is the specific job description of the individual, meaning in their direct job, are they involved with something unlawful or haram? Are they involved in interest transactions, recording interest transactions, etc.? The second aspect to look at is the income itself that the person is earning. So we can have scenarios where the two of them differ, meaning a person can have a completely halal job. A person can, their job is just to work on a website or whatever, clean the bank. But the issue is that their income is still coming from that same source, is coming from that bank, right? So yes, there are various fatwas on this topic, and even the senior muftis they have given fatwa in the Urdu fatwa books. Ask the Imam has also discussed this as well. Looking at all these various fatwa, the fact that working at a bank means that your income will still be coming, your income primarily is coming from unlawful sources. I would discourage working at a bank. Whether a person has an IT job, whether a person is even sweeping the bank, I would discourage Muslims from working at banks as a whole.
Okay, so
also there's a question on lab meat. So inshallah, if we at the American Fiqh Academy wrote a research paper on that. So inshallah, when you inshallah, when there's opportunity, I'd like to answer that as well. Inshallah.
So I'll bring that back to you. Okay. I'm going to extend that same question because it goes on to other issues, like for example, I think in terms of supermarkets. So somebody works in a supermarket. They call them superstores in America, yes? Yeah. Right,
supermarkets as well. Yeah, supermarkets as well.
We call it supermarkets as well. Okay, right. So if you're working in a supermarket and clearly there is a section there where they sell alcohol. So what would that be in terms of the permissibility for them to work in an environment like that?
Yeah. So also an important question as well. Again, there's two aspects. Alcohol has specific rulings because of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad with regards to selling alcohol, transporting alcohol, and so on. So alcohol, by default, has a stricter ruling. So as a Muslim, if there are various departments at a supermarket, the Muslim should avoid kind of being involved, either transporting the alcohol, selling the alcohol in any form whatsoever. The Muslim should avoid doing so. The issue sometimes comes up as a person who's a checker. We refer to the person who's checking people out, and sometimes you don't have a choice. Right? If you're checking people out, people are buying things, and alcohol goes through it. It does present a very difficult scenario. But again, there's two things to look at. One is the income that the person's earning. So looking at the supermarket, is the majority of the income coming from the supermarket from haram sources or halal sources? That will impact this individual's income as well, right? So if the majority is coming from unlawful sources, the person should avoid working there. If the majority of the income is coming from lawful sources, then looking at that majority, even though there are some unlawful aspects, we will still say the person's income is halal. Now, the separate issue is, in their specific job description, can they avoid being involved with the alcohol and the haram items? Avoid selling those items, avoid, for example, transporting those items, cleaning those items, etc. So the person should also, in their job description, maybe choose to be transferred to another department or another place in the store, which would avoid dealing with these haram products. Inshallah, the other panelists are welcome to inshallah share their research as well.
Mufti Saab, since you've taken up your seatbelt and you're quite comfortable now, I'll ask you the same question that you want to answer, which is regarding lamb meat. So, okay. Is that permissible? Is that permissible to consume?
Yeah. So, as Abdullah bin Abbas anhu used to say, "Saqattu ala khabir." Right. So, that alhamdulillah, this is a question that alhamdulillah we took on. Sci-fi fiqh. So, inshallah, maybe the next panel will be sci-fi fiqh questions.
Inshallah.
So, lab meat. Alhamdulillah, the American Fiqh Academy has been around now for about 4 years, and I think it's about 2 years ago that this question of lab meat came up, and I encouraged the American Fiqh Academy, let's take on this question. So alhamdulillah, we each did our own research. I read through one of the books. I think it's called Lab Meat. And alhamdulillah, after doing research, alhamdulillah, we came to a unanimous conclusion. So there's a few things to consider here. Number one is with lab meat, one is the halal haram point of view, and one is the ethical point of view. And as in many other issues, we have to separate the two, right? So there are many things out there right now which perhaps from a halal haram point of view, the ruling is one thing, but considering ethical considerations and considering ethical factors is a separate matter. So some background behind lab meat. Why is there such a craze? Why are people? Why is there so much hype about it? Right. So it is still not commercially viable. Right. And perhaps it's going to be a few years before we can afford lab meat. As things stand right now, a halal lab meat burger would probably cost about $1,000, maybe 1,000 pounds. Right. It's still they still don't have economies of scale. So practically, we're not going to see lab meat in the supermarkets or in the stores anytime soon. Maybe it'll still take a few years. But the argument is as follows: why is there a need for lab meat? That we are facing meat shortages, and also there's some ethical concerns about how animals are raised, specifically livestock, the resources, the energy, the land which is consumed by specifically setting up areas for cattle, for chickens, the resources that are spent, also the fact that in many cases these animals are treated inhumanely. They're fed filth. Sorry for lack of a word. They're fed filth. So the argument is lab meat is clean meat. Right? The way lab meat is made it is clean meat, and it doesn't have many of the negative factors which is found in conventional meat or meat which is sold in our supermarkets. So that's some background. Why is lab meat important? Why is it an issue? Now, from a halal and haram point of view, we need to analyze the process by which lab meat is made. So normally what happens, just to kind of summarize the process, normally what happens is a muscle cell is taken from an animal. Sometimes the animal is live, sometimes the animal is dead. Right? So this growth cell, there's a specific term for it. This muscle growth cell is taken from the animal, and what happens if it's put in a petri dish in a lab environment, that muscle cell will start multiplying. Right? Of course, you require some nutrients. You require certain conditions for that muscle to grow. But the way that muscle cell works is it will multiply. And after a lot of work and a lot of energy, after a long period of time, that muscle cell will multiply, and you now have something in the form of meat. Now, from the perspective of life and death, that meat technically does not have life, right? It grows in a dish. It is not alive, right? But the muscle cell can multiply. There's no head in that lab meat. There's no feet, right? It is a muscle cell which is multiplying. So now, looking at it from a halal haram point of view, the question is going back to that starter cell, that initial muscle cell that's used. And was that muscle cell, number one, taken from a live animal or a dead animal? Now, as far as I understand, currently in Europe, the muscle cell must be taken from a dead animal. Right? According to my research, what was stated in a number of these books, there are some restrictions in Europe. So as a result, generally those muscle cells, those starter cells, are taken from dead animals. Here in America, we have both. We have we have muscle cells or starter cells taken from live animals and dead animals both. So the main principle to consider here with regards to the ruling for lab meat is the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Ma ubina min al-hayy fahuwa mayyit. Ma ubina min al-hayy fahuwa mayyit." So specifically in our American context, because we have a good percentage of those starter cells are taken from live animals, right? They perform a small operation. I forget the name of the operation, but while the animal is alive, they take out the muscle cell and now they put it in the lab dish. So if that is the case, that meat, the resulting meat, which comes from that live starter cell, that meat will be haram, will be unlawful to consume. So you may ask now, what is the application for us? Specifically, is there a scenario where we can make our own halal lamb meat? So it is possible, ethical considerations aside, there is a halal way to do so. And the halal way to do so would be, especially in the European context, slaughter an animal according to the Islamic law. Right? And you can still, that starter cell, you can still take it out right after the slaughter. So as we know, once you slaughter an animal according to Islamic law, that animal now is halal. The parts of the animal, including the starter cell, including the muscles, including the blood that flows out, that remains, so all the parts of the animal are lawful to consume. And if you were to take that muscle cell out for the animal, use it in a petri dish, you could now theoretically create halal lab meat. Right? So this is the discussion from Islamic point of view. Yes, if that dead animal was not slaughtered according to Islamic way as well, then that the resulting meat will also be haram. Right? So you can say roughly there are three scenarios. Was the starter cell taken from a live animal or dead animal? Taken from a live animal will be haram. Was the starter cell taken from a dead animal, which is halal? Yes, then there's a chance then the resulting lab meat can also be halal. Was the starter cell taken from from a dead animal, which was not slaughtered according to Islamic law? That scenario will also not be halal. A few other considerations as well. Normally when that...
I'm going to have to push you a bit, Mufti Saab, because we're running out of time. So just give a final statement, inshallah.
Yeah, so the final statement would be, there is some scope to for Muslims to produce halal lab meat, specifically in the situation where the starter cell is taken from a dead animal that was slaughtered according to Islamic law. Yeah, that is the summary, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Very comprehensive answer, mashallah. Okay, I'm going to go to Mufti Amjad, and then I'll go to Mufti Zubair after that. But generally speaking, this is quite a broad question, really, and it can be quite complex. It's not always straightforward. And so a question regarding free mixing in certain environments. Now, I know your area is fiqh al-aqliyat, so you can understand from a perspective that we're living in a country where, you know, free mixing is the norm, yeah, at workplaces and everywhere we go. Now, are there any bits of advice that you can give us as Muslims who are working, and this is about, you know, public life, working environment and those kind of environments? What kind of advice would you give us in terms of how we interact with the opposite gender or the opposite sex? I have to be very careful the words I use nowadays, you know, in the kind of environment that we live in. What kind of advice would you give? So Mufti Saab, I'm coming to you. You know, how should I work in this kind of environment? I have, you know, women all around me. You know, what advice would you give me?
So, you know, the meat that's made in the laboratory. How come I always get the short straw? Cryptocurrency, gender mixing. I don't know what we got lined up for me. What we got lined up for me next? I don't know. This is a short straw. I prefer the lab meat answer. I was just going to go down that road again. Okay, anyway, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, there's I spent a lot of time, as you know, Dr. Saab, over the last sort of I don't know, 10 years, maybe or so, 15 years, looking at this particular topic of Muslim minority.
That's why I'm asking you.
And you know, it's an area which obviously is of you know, real issues, basically, because as our population is moving more and more towards the West, with new migrations because of wars and famines, then you know, it's probably around 40 to 45% of Muslims now live as a minority, which is huge, especially when you take India into consideration as well. So in fact, you would argue that soon the scales will tip the other way, that Muslims will live as a minority rather than live in majority states. And that's remarkable for a community, you know, only 100 years ago when it was completely the other way around. So these are really fast changes that are happening. And obviously there's also social changes that are taking place as well. I understand it in two ways. One is to impose an Islamic culture. And one is to provide guidance for areas where you cannot impose an Islamic culture. So I've kind of divided the world up, or I've divided, you know, Western Europe, America, whatever, up into two areas. One is where you can impose an Islamic culture, an Islamic ethos. I'm talking about the madaris, the masajids, places which are our cocoons, places which, you know, we as hermits we run to. Basically, you know, we feel like a fish out of water as soon as we're out of that environment. So we have those environments, and obviously you would apply the Sharia in its holiest way possible in order to kind of work and operate in that way. There are obviously, even in those environments, certain times where you have no choice. For example, if you're involved in, say, Islamic schools or madaris where you have female staff members, and then there's the issue of training, there's the issue of all that which goes with it. So there has to be a certain element of professionalism that has to come in. And I think we have to kind of build a moral code which is based on the Sharia of this engagement. But I think probably more important is where we cannot control the environment. This is areas where we can't, to a certain extent, control the environment. What do we do where we can't control the environment? I think we're past that stage where we said, look, just stick to the madrasa, brother. You know, get a job in the madrasa and you're safe. You know, realistically speaking, that's not an answer. In fact, we're probably ducking the answer. We have to work in the communities that we work in schools that we work in the hospitals that we work in, and just even in the private sector that we work in. So there has to be a certain element of what we would call the kind of ethos or culture, I use the word as well, where we would understand what the Sharia permits and doesn't permit. So without imposing, we're sort of self-imposing. And in that way, what I mean is that you would limit interactions as much as you possibly could. If you cannot limit interactions because they're on your team or you've got to work with them, then you would limit maybe the banter, maybe a little bit of the jokingness, whatever. That doesn't mean that you cannot be friendly, but it's knowing where your boundaries are. And in a way, this Me Too thing has really been has been a bit positive for the Muslim community, because where the odd touch of the shoulder and the odd remark that could be made before, now people are a little bit more conscious. In fact, some people literally have chaperones with them now when they walk around into offices where there's only a female there, for fear that there could be repercussions and ramifications if something is said out of context. So I think, you know, it's really taking that Me Too philosophy. We already had the Me Too philosophy even before the Me Too philosophy came along. And it's really setting boundaries, professional boundaries. We would call them ethical boundaries, in which our ethics is obviously based on our Sharia, what it permits and doesn't permit. I think to say that, you know, you can't talk to a female worker, that's just not even realistic. And then to apply the hukum that this person is committing haram, then in a way what we're doing is we're putting a lot of people in a dangerous place. We or rather the fuqaha, the ulama, have to try to keep within the broad understanding of the Sharia in order to try to keep everybody, you know, within that. And, you know, even though I said this is a, you know, and you introduced it as a fiqh al-aqaliyat issue, in reality it's not. You know, look at Pakistan, look at Bangladesh, look at any Muslim country. Muslim men and Muslim women are working in the same spaces. Once the woman's role went out from being a housemaker, somebody that you know stays at home and does the whatever, and she became into the public world, then this is something that we have to tackle. You know, to duck that, we cannot duck that. The fuqaha have the pasta to deal with even bigger issues, and it's irresponsible for ulama to sort of just duck that question. I hope I haven't ducked it before I get accused of that on the chat or something. So it's developing that. Unfortunately, as you know yourself as well, research is something which is hardly funded within the Islamic world. It's something, you know, it's very pleasant to hear Mufti Abdullah Saab's you know, Fiqh Academy. It's good to see that there's research going on. Very vital that we have institutes, not just for tadris, but for, you know, research. Research is fundamental, and you know my background as well. And that's really where we need to do the social interactions, whether it's a food technology, whatever it may be. That's something that we need to develop, and it's, you know, and so that's where I would say, if there's, you know, people with big pockets out there, they need to support ulama like the panelists we've got here, mashallah, in order to look at these areas, dedicate their experience and skills in order to get us to navigate. As I said, the Sharia for me, it will always be applicable until the day of judgment. If it's always going to be applicable until the day of judgment, then there's solutions for dealing with us in minority scenarios.
Alhamdulillah, that's a useful response. Mufti Zubair, I'm going to finish on you. Now, I've got quite an again advice, not necessarily fatwa or whatever, but generally we're looking at our contemporary climate. Our contemporary climate is such where, unfortunately, the divorce rates are going up. Even within Muslim communities. Now we have issues in terms of finance, discontent and various things that happen around that. So let's say you've got a husband-wife, and they've been basically paying into different things like mortgages. So they've had equal share in terms of the mortgage that they put into a property, but the mortgage hasn't been, or the house has not been put down on the, on the wife's name. It's just been on the husband's name for cultural reasons, whatever. Yeah. Now, in a situation like that, from an Islamic perspective, the interesting thing here is because we have the law of the country, okay, which allows, clearly that plays a very important role in terms of these discussions. But from a solely Sharia perspective, because the wife has put in half the amount and her name's not written on the final sort of mortgage deed in terms of her being the owner of the property, what would the Sharia perspective be to that? This is a question from a sister, and she's got these concerns. And I can imagine this is happening quite frequently. I understand there's the complexity of that question, but just as a brief advice, maybe, how would you respond to that if somebody was to come to you with this?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What I would say is, first of all, even between husband and wife, we need to be clear in our financial dealings. And it is this lack of clarity which brings about issues. Things are left unsaid, and expectations are held, and then they don't materialize. So even amongst husband and wife, where you don't follow strict and fast rules on many things that you commonly own together, or you use one of each other's items, in terms of property, etc., it's essential that we are very clear in exactly who owns what. And so the Sharia would look at the situation as it actually is. Okay, so if a husband and wife purchase a property and the wife's name, for example, for some whatever reason, is not on the deeds, but the understanding between the husband and wife is that this property belongs to both of us, then even though it's not on the deeds, then Islamically it would belong to both of them. And my advice would be
written down between them. So this is not actually, regardless of it being written down within the property deeds.
Yeah.
Even if it's not written down between both of them.
Even if it's not written down amongst themselves, and the understanding between them is like husband and wife. It's not a business transaction. It's a relationship, hopefully based on love and mutual trust, etc. And so you tend to find people not writing things down. But the understanding between themselves, if it is that this house belongs to both of us, and we are both, equal owners of the house, I'm not sure why she wouldn't have her name on the mortgage or the deeds in this particular situation. But for some reason, they didn't have it. Islam would look at actually what is the real situation, what is the actual situation here, as opposed to what they are recording for some some interest. Equally so, if the wife's name is actually on the deeds, but everybody knows that this house doesn't belong to both of them, it belongs only to the husband, then simply by her name being on the deeds doesn't Islamically confer ownership onto her. It's actually what actually is the case here. So, and that is where clarity is needed. And my advice would be is that if you are, part owner of the house, then your name should be on the deed. And if you are not, then it's probably advisable not to put it on the deed.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Our time, unfortunately, has run out. So first of all and foremost, I would really like to thank the ulama who've been present on our panel, for number one, for their time, number two, for their excellent responses, mashallah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them immensely in the work that they do to serve their communities. Mashallah, all of them are very active in our communities. And alhamdulillah, we're very fortunate at Al Balagh Academy to have them all as our instructors on many of our courses. So, a lot of thanks goes out to all of them. Jazakumullah khair. And then finally, I'm just going to finish off by talking about our course on fiqh of halal and haram. As you can see here, there's been a number of different questions. I've only just gone through about 10% of the questions in reality. So you can imagine the real demand there is for us to know about issues related to halal and haram. So at Balagh Academy, we've actually now set up a course which will also consist of approximately over 10 Sharia scholars, including the 3 that we have today, on a number of different topics, very similar to the kind of questions that we've asked. And I recognize that a lot of you asking questions much more detailed related to some of the questions that we already discussed. So this will be an excellent opportunity for you, number one, to hear the basics, the principles of all these different discussions that we've talked about, as well as the chance for you to ask more detailed questions from our scholars who are going to be instructing on this course. So the concept of halal and haram, what does that actually mean? Food and medicine, Islamic dress, which is something we've not talked much about, but that will be something we will talk about. Also beautification, makeup, cosmetics, cosmetic surgeries and things like that. These are very, very common questions. Questions around home living and Islamic rulings, questions around the home, so even questions around using social media, how to deal with teenagers, even the sort of general rulings about how teenagers are behaving today, how should Muslim parents respond to them. So it's not just about fiqh responses, but also elements of wisdom and advice. Islamic rulings around TV usage, music and movies. Also relation to education, going to a different town, for example, to study at a university, sending your daughters, and various other things like that. How they should be interacting at work. So profession, job and earning, halal and haram, some of the things that we talked about today. Also, generally, women in contemporary society, what's expected of women, what kind of things can women do, what they cannot do in certain environments. And finally, family life and Islamic rulings related to nikah, in the kind of this kind of electronic media that we have, the internet media that we have, even discussions about doing nikah over the internet, and also in relation to some of the questions related to divorce, and even a divorce that's been stipulated by the courts, would that hold as a divorce? These kind of questions and many more will all be addressed, inshallah, on this particular course. So just to give you a highlight about the sort of the details of the course, I'm just going to point out a couple of figures that I've been told to give, which gives you a good understanding about what we'll be dealing with. So we'll have 2 levels. So it'll be halal and haram, the fiqh of halal and haram. There'll be 2 levels, level 1. And for those of you who want to go into more detail, level 2. There'll be approximately 45 and more teaching hours on the subject. On these subjects, there will be approximately over 300, more than 300 fatwa and Islamic rulings discussed. You're looking at about 150 relevant principles that will be discussed within those discussions, and also over 100 plus contemporary case studies. So you can already see it'll be quite comprehensive, very relevant, inshallah. We'll make it sure that it's very relevant to today. So this is an excellent opportunity for you to join this course on the fiqh of halal and haram. There'll be a link now sent to you if it's not already been sent for the level 1, inshallah. So the course is already open, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to talk to the ulama that we have on the panel today, as well as many other ulama around the world. So jazakallah khair for joining us, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to be able to live a life where we are obedient and we are obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all things that we do, inshallah. So let's pray that inshallah Allah makes our life easy in this sense. Jazakumullah khair for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.